So the issue of revenue collection, talking about taxes, we know that one of the discouraging factors for a lot of Nigerians is the lack of trust, on what the taxes are being used for. So we go back to talking about governance, and how to win back that confidence, but not just in the public sector, also in the private sector. So now we've been hearing a phrase such as transformational governance. Well, what does this entail? We're going to be speaking to Ayatola Jagun. She is a board member with Anti-Corruption and Governance with United Nations Global Impact Network in Nigeria. Ayatola, good to have you in the studio.
Thank you for having me, Ini.
Great. So tell us about this transformational governance. We've heard of corporate governance and all of that. Now we want to transform, which obviously we need in Nigeria, but getting to do it is always another thing. But tell us about it first.
So transformational governance is really nothing new. In the sense that it is, I think, a step up from corporate governance. We're all used to corporate governance as a legal concept. Transformational governance is more of a principles-based approach that takes it to a next level, asking for companies to be more ethical, inclusive, transparent in the way they do things, not just for the benefit of the company or within the sphere they operate, but for wider societal impact. And I think that's where the tension is, if there is a tension, because it's based and built on SDG 16, which is on peace, justice, and strong institutions. So how does business or the private sector get itself into that sphere of peace, justice, and strong institutions without stepping on the toes of national sovereignty? That's really what it's about. But again, businesses don't operate in a vacuum. And we've seen how things like COVID that have a wider impact on the whole of society. We've seen how the disputes, for instance, in some of the northern parts of the country, and the internal displacement has also had an impact. And of course, more recently, the food insecurity, how that has had an impact, and business has had to, maybe take a response. We had a situation where, for instance, Olam had to, and I think flour mills, had to decide not to offtake certain grains which people need to survive. And this is where businesses can step into the realms of transformational governance and change their contracting, change the way they do things, behave in a more ethical manner that goes beyond just profit for the benefit of wider society.
But so, as a business, why should I get involved with this?
Because what happens in the country has an impact on you. There's no point in having the best in class products if the populace can't afford it, right? And there's no point also where people are in dire need, and the situation in the countries can be volatile if people are hungry and businesses say, oh, it doesn't concern me, I'm just here to make profit. Eventually, there has to be an enabling environment, and that enabling environment is not just one of having the right regulations, it's also having a peaceful environment where you can operate. We've seen what's happened in the Niger Delta region, where oil companies have turned a blind eye to community requirements and community needs, host community needs. At the end of the day, the communities give you a license to operate. And if they're not happy, you cannot do business in those environments, in a profitable way. We see the situation that happened in Ogoniland, where up till today, Shell has been unable to operate in that region because things got out of hand. And these are things to do with human rights and alleged human rights abuses. And so, we then have a situation where that then impacts on your business. So not only do businesses have a business case to get involved in transformational governance, we're saying that they also have an ethical obligation to get involved in transformational governance. We all work with companies. We are citizens of Nigeria, right? And what happens in the country impacts on us. And we will take those things to work. So inclusivity is also prioritizing the things that are important to your employees. And what's important to your employees is not just that they get a salary at the end of the day, but that the companies they work for are sustainable in the long term because so many other people are depending on that salary. Yeah.
And this is supposed to also help curb corruption?
Yeah, absolutely. Because, it's one thing to say, pay your taxes. It's another thing to say, not only pay your taxes, but again, operate in such a manner that you as a business become sustainable. We've all heard the case that good corporate governance leads to sustainable businesses that can continue in the long term. If, again, the businesses are not operating in a manner that enables them to continue long term, then it impacts on everything. So corruption actually eats not just at the fabric of society, it actually eats at the long-term sustainability of any company or any business at all.
But what would transformational governance look like in the public sector?
So, very interesting, because we increasingly have state-owned businesses or state-owned companies that are now becoming corporates in themselves. It's really calling for more accountability. That really is what it is, understanding who your stakeholders are. I was facilitating a course recently on, and one of the participants was in the public sector. And he was saying to me, I don't know that this really applies to me, because at the end of the day, my stakeholder is the Nigerian government. And I had to remind him that his stakeholder was not the Nigerian government. His stakeholder is 220 million Nigerian citizens. And so he has to be able to hear the voices of those 220 million Nigerian stakeholders when he is making decisions, when their board is sitting down to make decisions. And so what it looks like is a more responsive public sector.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I mean, that kind of sounds like the mind of an average politician, feeling like if you're a commissioner, then your stakeholder is your governor. If you're a governor, your stakeholder is the president, because that's where you get FAQ from, forgetting that when it's time to go to the polls,
Absolutely.
You will go back to the about 200 million Nigerians and campaign and ask for their votes, for them to have confidence in you, to choose you among others, to manage the resources for a certain number of years.
So that's what we're saying, that beyond that 4 years, and you see, this is where businesses are being put under pressure to act. We have a generation of Gen Zs, millennials, Gen Zs, alpha generation, who are not going to wait for 4 years to get change. And so increasingly you have a lot of, whether it's environmental activism, social activism, and they're going to companies to say, what are you doing about this? Because they understand that companies have some leverage with government. They have a voice. They're able to lobby responsibly to bring about change much more faster than going to the polls. And yet it's a mindset shift. So it's a cultural change that transformational governance is asking for. Another area is in risk management. A lot of, when you're in power for 4 years, your risk management tends to be more short to mid-term. Businesses have to risk manage for the long term. And I think that as a nation, we have to risk manage for the long term. And I think if we had been risk managing beyond a 4-year term or even 8-year term at best, perhaps some of the struggles we're having today with food insecurity, we will not have. Because in jurisdictions where that long-term risk management is done, there are granaries. The private sector is actually quite involved with the public sector in being able to manage some of these things that could come about. So it's working hand in hand. I'm really encouraged to see that our president has set up an economic advisory team made up of business people who do have those skill sets to be able to plan for the long term, who are more in touch with the stakeholders in terms of the consumers and even with the regulators and with their employees, and know what needs to be done to bring production up, to make sure that as a nation, we're earning revenue rather than being in a position where we're not, and we're borrowing just to be able to survive.
So I hear you talk about orientation, because when you say, for instance, the public sector, because the private sector knows, I mean, an entrepreneur knows I need to plan, I have to risk manage for this company for a long term. I'm not going anywhere. Yes. Even if I was to leave, then my child will step in, or,
Absolutely.
you know, somebody. But in the government, I have 4 years, max 8 years. But they also say that government is a continuum. But I think a lot of politicians actually forget that. How do we get disorientation or reorientation started, especially in the private sector, since that's where, the common resources are being managed? The public sector, the private sector, they know if I don't manage well, I go hungry. Yeah. But the public sector, I'm a politician, I get in there, I use the common resources for 4 years, whichever way I feel is good for me, and then I leave. So how do we get that reorientation started? Or has it already started, perhaps?
I'm very optimistic about Nigeria, and I pray that it has already started. The continuum you have is the civil service, right? And they are there for the long term. Politicians come, politicians go. But the civil servants who work for the MDAs are there. And it's a handshake. It's building partnerships. It's collective action. It's building partnerships with the different MDAs between the public sector, the private sector, and even the not-for-profit sector, and working on projects that are more long term and for the benefit of the country. And so it is important for businesses to then get involved in advocacy, in policy formulation. I'm really excited about all the good work that the NESG has been doing, working with the parliamentarians, and also through that being able to infuse some of that culture that you have in the private sector, in the public sector as well. I have, over the last, I would say, 4 years, deliberately sought to work with my regulators, for instance, the Financial Reporting Council and the Nigerian Climate Change Council. And we do have brilliant minds in the civil service. And so it's being able to work with those brilliant minds to bring about policies that work for business as well, that create that enabling environment.
Or is it implementation of the policies? So, because when you look at our policies, they're really brilliant, which tells you that the people behind it are brilliant, but we don't see it, coming into reality.
And that's where the accountability comes in. So building in place those accountability structures. And there are things that work. There have been some successes. There was a project that a colleague of mine, Soji Apampa, did with the Ports Authority, the World Maritime Council, and the ports, to ensure that corruption was reduced at the ports. And this was, again, the Shippers Council coming together and saying, we need to do something about this. Even us as a business, Owando as a business, when we were in the downstream, we came up with the offshore jetty to reduce congestion at the ports, to make sure that ships could berth at the jetty and move the refined petroleum products straight to the terminals. Again, reducing congestion at the ports, reducing demurrage, reducing, just that congestion. I think the private sector has the solution and has to come up with innovative solutions to a lot of the challenges we face. We just need the enablement, the enabling environment to be able to do so, the handshake with the public sector through the civil servants to be able to get something through to completion. We heard about what's just happened last week in Aba. This has been a long-term project which has finally seen fruition. The private sector is certainly going to benefit from it. And this is, again, a collaboration within multilaterals, the public sector, and the private sector to see this come to pass. And the more of these we have, the more we can, in terms of transformational governance, the more we can transform our society.
Yeah, we'll certainly look forward to more of that. Thank you so much, Ayotola Jagun, board member, anti-corruption and governance with the United Nations Global Compact Network Nigeria, and of course the Chief Compliance of Owando PLC.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your time. All right, let's take a break. When we come back, we'll head to the markets with Annuity Edits. To stay with us.